patients sometimes about clinical research, they don't necessarily know, if they have never done it, what's really involved. And there are a lot of different things that qualify as clinical research. So the first thing I want to start with is what is a rare disease? And so in the US, this is defined as a condition affecting less than 200,000 people. But of course, some diseases are rarer than others. And you will sometimes see people talk about zebras, or if you look up the rare disease awareness ribbon, just like there's a breast cancer ribbon and things for different diseases, the rare disease ribbon actually has zebra stripes on it. And that comes from a medical education kind of terminology. That somebody, I don't know who, many years ago said, you know, if you're outside and you hear hoofbeats, you think of horses, because you're probably not going to run into a zebra in North America. And the unicorns I added on there because, well, you probably are going to see unicorns either, and unicorns are even more rare than zebras. But also, as you all know, and as has been emphasized this morning, rare does not mean not important. And in fact, rare diseases have often taught us a lot about common diseases as well. So, there's approximately 331 million people in the US. I don't remember when I pulled this number, so I'm sure it's higher now. And the estimates are that there are about 7,000 different rare diseases. But based on their overall prevalence, what that means is up to about 9% of the general population will have a rare disease, one or the other of some rare disease, which is actually a pretty big number if you apply that to 331 million people. But then, if rare disease, and in fact, actually, this rare diseases are collectively common was actually the theme for one of our broad general science research meetings here at IU this fall. So, but I've often had patients with different rare diseases. I deal with bone diseases mainly, but different rare diseases ask, why is it so hard for me to find a doctor in my area that knows about my rare disease? Or to even get the diagnosis made in the first place? There's sort of two reasons for that. Remember that first thing, that when you hear hoofbeats, you think of horses. So when you see a particular symptom, doctors are trained, because it's most cost effective and time effective, to think first of what are the common things that cause this? Because that's most likely what your average doctor in their office is going to see. But remember, rare diseases are very common, but there's about 7,000 different rare diseases. So your primary care doctor, a very busy primary care doctor, probably has somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people that they follow over time in their practice. That number may be a little high. But what that means is, even if every one of them had a rare disease, they wouldn't see most of the rare diseases. And the truth is, their chance of seeing any individual one of the rare diseases is really low. So they spend their time knowing about ear infections and heart attacks and high cholesterol and diabetes and all the things they're going to see every single day. And we want them to do that because we want them to be able to deal with all of the common things that even patients with rare diseases also get. So it's possible to have a rare disease like osteopetrosis and also have a really common disease like diabetes. But Shannon said something that's really important. What you want is for your doctor, even if they've never heard of your rare disease before, to be willing to learn something about it, help you get to a specialist that understands it if needed, and to work to build their own knowledge to work with that, to work with you and with your other specialists, because then everybody benefits in that situation. But of course, the patient journey varies. And this is just an example of a time course going through that somebody may start to have some symptoms. Maybe they start all of a sudden, maybe they start really gradually. And over time, people get testing, and then they might have other symptoms and they might not come up with a diagnosis, or they may be attributed to something else, or in osteopetrosis, somebody may just have a broken bone and nobody notices the bone is super dense. And so there may be delays in getting to an eventual diagnosis, and then perhaps further delays in getting to a treatment. But sometimes nobody knows the best treatment, even the experts. Or sometimes there's no known treatment for a disease yet, and this is especially common, especially frequent in rare diseases. So, without research, the treatment for any disease, common or rare, never gets better. The only way medicine for you or for your children or your children's children or for anybody ever gets better is because of research. And it's not just research in the lab, in the using animal models or computer models or cell cultures. All research to help people has to at some point involve people as patients in the research. And so this is just an example of some of the different parts where people end up doing participating in research or engaging in research. We often use animal models, we often use cell cultures, and we often use computer models or computer analysis of data from different settings. But eventually, something has to be done for the first time in people. And it has to be done in a way that is evaluated so that not just one doctor and one patient learn something about this, but so that medicine and science, the medicine and the scientific community in general learn something. So this is why we need research. We have to do research to understand why a disease even happens and how it works. And even in osteopetrosis, as we've talked about, we understand parts of it, but we don't fully understand all of even how it works. But you also have to do research to figure out how to diagnose it. Sometimes there's not an existing diagnostic test for a particular disease or a particular diagnosis test that predicts what's going to happen next over the next several years or something like that. And so we have to do research to develop those tests and to figure out how well they work. Research is also important for understanding the consequences of a disease and to prevent different complications, and ultimately how best to treat it. And most of these things only can be done in human research. Many of them have steps that have to be done in one of these other models beforehand, but most of these can only be done with people participating in research as patients. So here's an example from osteopetrosis. So first, we study a new medication in animals and cells before trying it in people. And so Dr. Ekon's lab has this mouse with the mutation that's common in osteopetrosis. And Imran back there and our lab colleagues did a study using interferon gamma injections, and it seemed to help the mouse. But every medicine still has to be studied in people before you know if it works and is safe in people in general. And so we did a study in people using interferon gamma, and it did not really seem to help as far as the measures that we were trying to do. It didn't help the bone measures that we were trying to engage in. And these are papers that are already published and are published by members of the osteopetrosis scientific community that are participating in this particular meeting. But the research journey also is highly variable. It is not as simple as, oh, we found something in the lab and we tested it in people, and then 3 months later we have some new treatment that we can give people. The research journey is long and it's got lots of setbacks. And one of the really important things, and one of the things we're working on for as part of the osteopetrosis study that some of you participated in yesterday, is this natural history. So it's not enough to just say, this is what the general features of the disease are. In order to understand a disease, you have to know what happens over time. And this is especially important because sometimes a medical treatment takes a disease and moves it backwards so that it's not as, so that you're not having the features be as bad. So it's, you may have something, a symptom that's at this level and you may make it better. Or a blood test that's at this level and you make it normal. But sometimes improvement in a disease with a medicine is keeping it from getting worse. So it does sometimes, and so you need to know how fast something gets worse or how fast something changes, basically what's happening over time, so that you know if you have a new medicine, are you impacting that? And again, you know, as part of the research journey, we develop new treatments, and sometimes we think we're developing a new treatment and it doesn't work out, so we have to go back. And so that's what all these backyards are, that there are lots of places where researchers have to go back, and over until finally there's a new treatment available. So hopefully you've picked up on my general theme, which is research is necessary in order to improve treatment for any disease. But it's also important to know that research is voluntary, and we do this, it's important for when you participate in research that that for both us and for you to understand what's involved, what are the risks and the benefits, and that you are in agreement with participating in research. Nobody can force you to do research. And research is done in humans with respect for participants, and to try to balance the risks and benefits. And we even have whole committees that every research study has to go before to try to figure out, okay, are they doing all of these things appropriately? And ultimately, they will help both you and the doctor understand the condition better. But every clinical research study is different. They have different goals. Obviously, if they're in different diseases, they may measure different things or do different kinds of tests. Some of them may be blood tests. Some of them may be bone density tests. Some of them may be physical muscle strength tests or different things. And different research studies some involve treatment and some don't involve a specific treatment. And I've seen research studies that are just one visit, one point in time. I've seen research studies where somebody is monitored several times over 24 hours, or things that may go on a week, or a month, or several months, or several years. So there are a couple of different broad category of clinical research studies, and the first I'm going to talk about is observational studies. And the observational studies tend to have two different kinds of characteristics. One is something called a qualitative study, where we're really trying to assess what are the qualities of a person's experience? What are the different things that are important to them in their disease or during their treatment? And this is often conducted by a researcher meeting with a group of people or asking open-ended questions. So open-ended questions just means it's not like a multiple choice test where your answers are A, B, C, or D and you have to pick one. It's what do you think about this? And there's a line, and you just answer whatever comes to mind. Or some things are quantitative, and so this means things that generate numbers or measurements, like a bone density test or a blood test. Those are quantitative kind of measurements. And some observational studies are retrospective, which means that it's looking at information from the past. So I have done some studies that are retrospective. We pull information out of the medical records of a group of patients with a certain disorder, and we look and see what happened to them. Now there are some problems with that because you don't have control over what actually was measured, and you're just stuck with whatever was actually done by that patient and that doctor in the past. But in prospective studies, so studies where we're enrolling people and moving into the future, then we have control over what things are measured. We decide we're going to do this test at this time so that we can get that information. Sometimes you might hear of something called a cross-sectional study. That's where we take maybe 10 people or 100 people, measure them all once, and we look at what proportion of patients with this condition have this feature and that feature and other features. Or a natural history study, like we talked about, that's actually looking over time. So one visit one year, one visit the next year, or maybe one visit every month, Often natural history studies for chronic diseases need to go on for many years because sometimes things change quickly and sometimes things change slowly as part of the disease. So in a prospective study, the patient comes to the center, the research center usually, to get certain measures. This can be a blood test, it can be height and weight measurements, blood pressure, bone density tests, x-rays. The doctor may examine the patient, listen to their heart, and measure things. People often also fill out surveys or questionnaires. There's an important factor, an important category of information called patient-reported outcomes. And these are really important to doctors and to patients and to the FDA because they want to know also what is the patient's experience with the disease. And that is very, very important. Another way we get some of this information is through registries. And so registries are often collected on a web-based platform. And you heard an example of one of those this morning, that was the Beyond XLH registry. But also, as part of our research studies, Linda Polgreen, who you'll hear from a little bit later today, is conducting a registry that's internet-based of osteopetrosis itself. And again, this is surveys and collecting medical information from patients and or their doctors. And these can also collect information once or multiple different times over the course of some period of years. So the other thing that you'll see about research is sometimes a research study is only at one place. So maybe we're doing a research study and we're only doing it at IU. Or sometimes a research study has two places. It might be conducted at IU and University of Kentucky. Or can have several sites across the country or across multiple different countries. And of course, the more sites that are involved, the more complicated the research is, but also the more patients you can get enrolled. And sometimes for rare diseases, it can be very useful to have multiple sites involved in a research study. I'm going to use a term now that may not mean what you think it means. So the term is clinical trials. When people hear the word trial, they often think of a courtroom drama, Law and Order, or something where people are going before a jury and suing somebody or prosecuting a crime, and that's really not what clinical trials are. In science, a trial is a special kind of experiment designed to see what happens when you do something. So not just what's happening by itself, but what happens when you do something. Now that something may be a new medicine, that may be a new surgery, that may be a new pacemaker, or something like that. And this is actually how we find out if I develop a new blood test, if it's predictive of the diagnosis or of the outcomes. Or it's how we tell if a new treatment works. We actually have to do clinical trials not just to see, does this medicine work better than nothing, or does it work better than other medicines that we use in a disease? Early on, you have to even figure out what's the right dose of the medicine. We use studies from animals to help us figure that out, but ultimately, animals are not people. And so we have to start over. We start at a low dose, and we try additional doses to see both what dose is tolerated, what dose is safe, and also what dose works for medications. And also to figure out how long you're supposed to treat something, or how early in a disease you need to treat something. Sometimes you'll see in the news mentions of comparative effectiveness. So there is this drug for this disease, and there is that drug for this disease. And people have to do a clinical trial sometimes to figure out which one works best. Or do you need a combination of treatments? And also, clinical trials give us information about side effects. Now, this sort of fell apart a little bit here, but these are just broad categories of different kinds of things you can measure or test in clinical trials. We're used to thinking of drugs, but again, surgeries or medical devices or physical therapy or different exercises, or even people do clinical trials of different kinds of nutritional supplements. So, if you're in a research study, if you may do an observational study which has no intervention. So this is just visually talking about some of the things I was mentioning before. So every study has a criteria. You have what do you need to have and what are you allowed to have to get into the study? And that's mostly to help us be able to understand and analyze the data most effectively. And maybe you have one study visit, or maybe there's a bunch of study visits over time before the end of the study. And then clinical trials have an intervention. They have something that you're doing so that you can see what happens. And so again, there may be one study visit, or there may be multiple study visits over time. Clinical research trials, our best clinical research trials are actually something we call a controlled clinical trial. So what that means is that people are placed in two groups, and one group gets a treatment, maybe it's a study drug number one, and the other group gets a different study drug, or maybe they get no drug. Or maybe they get something that we call a placebo, and I'll talk about what that is. And again, you monitor them over time to see what the effect of that treatment is and which one works better. Okay. The best treatments, or the best studies are where the doctor doesn't just say, you get this one and you get that one. Because preconceived notions of the doctor affect what that decision is. And usually when we're doing these studies because we don't actually know for sure what the best option is. And so the best studies are when we randomly assign the people who enroll in the study to be in one group or the other. And we use computers usually to do that. The next important level is something called blinded studies, which means that you may be on medicine, but you don't know which one of these two treatments you're actually getting, because we're giving both people something. So you can do a study where you put somebody on a drug and put another group not on a medicine, and you just follow them, and everybody knows where they are. That's called open label. But the best ones are blinded, because then the patient doesn't know which treatment they're getting. And that's really important because we have symptoms all the time. You wake up one day and your back hurts, or you have a runny nose one day, and it's probably not due to either of the medicines, but if you know you're on a medicine, sometimes you attribute the symptom to that medicine. And so this gives us a lot of information because then we record things and we find out, oh, well, the same number of people had a headache at some point during their treatment in both groups. So in that case, headache is not really a side effect of that medicine. But it's even better to have a study that's double-blinded. And that means the patient doesn't know, and the researcher, the doctor that's working with you also doesn't know which group you're in until the end of the study. And then what they do is, at the end of the study, after they've done all of the measurements, then a statistics person will go through and say, okay, this is how frequent different things were, and this is how much improvement you had in different measures. So for example, you wait till the end and you use ideally a very objective measure, for example, bone density, is better than me just saying, I think you're doing better and I think you're doing worse. If you have a bone density, that gives you a number. And then you can say, people on this medicine improved their bone density by this much, and people in this medicine, their bone density got worse by this much. And of course, that's just one example. When you participate in clinical research, the other factor is time. And so how long a study visit is, or how long the entire study is, really depends on what questions the study is designed to answer. Some things, like changes in bone, take a long time to happen just in the course of nature. So those studies often have to take longer to try to figure out what's happening to the bone. I made mention of placebo. And you can actually find some good information on this at the National Institutes for Health website and some other places on what is a placebo control. So remember I talked about some patients being randomized to get either a study drug or sometimes no drug or something called a placebo. A placebo is a medicine, maybe it's a pill, that they make to look just like the other pill. Or if it's an injection, you make it to look just like the injection of the actual medicine, and so that it facilitates you and your doctor not knowing which one you're getting. Because then it does a better, the information we get from those studies is better regarding both the benefits of a medicine and also of the side effects. Because, again, when you're doing a study, I've had some people be on a medicine and feel like, oh, this is making me feel wonderful, like immediately. And it's something that I know would take weeks for it to actually make a change. And so sometimes you want to know, is the apparent benefit just a benefit from being involved in a study that somebody is feeling better, or is it something that's actually due to the medicine itself? And at the same time, you want to know, are the side effects different? The other important reason for using a placebo is it's hard to take a medicine once a day or twice a day or more than once a day. And so if you're in a study and you know, okay, I'm on the actual medicine, okay, I'm going to try to take it, and if you knew I'm not on the actual medicine, but I'm on this, I'm still supposed to take this medicine or this fake version of the medicine every day, you're not going to be as motivated to try to take that, and then you get not as good of information. So that adds an extra level of aid to the researchers for understanding both the benefits and the side effects of medicines. And of course, for all medicines that we hope to get approved, that we hope to get eventually approved, the ideal medicine has a lot of benefit and very few side effects. And those are important things to know before, if you can, before it is released or approved by the FDA to the general population. We also need research participants of different ages. We need both male and female participants. We need different races, and also people with different disease severity for different research studies. And in addition, you actually need healthy controls for comparison, because it's kind of important to know, is something a feature of the disease, or is something just something that everybody else gets too? And of course, for many diseases, the things that you get are also things that other people get, or you just, one disease gets it more than the general population. All right, it's my favorite slide in the whole thing. Maybe not, but children, certainly in medical education, you hear this a lot, that children are not just little adults, but I'm trained in both pediatrics and adult medicine. And I also like to say the opposite, that adults are not just big children, even though we may act like it sometimes. And that's because the biology of a growing child is different than the biology of an adult in their 20s, or an adult in their 30s, or 40s, or 50s, or older. And when we do research of new medicines, we frequently try them in adults before we try them in children, if it's a disease that affects both adults and children, so that we can establish some idea of how safe and how well it works before we start trying to test the drug in children. But again, there's a really important factor that many drugs that are on the market for a lot of different conditions are approved in adults, but aren't specifically approved in children, which means sometimes the necessary tests for FDA approval were never done. And I think I saw something recently that it's been since I think sometime in the 1990s since any drug was formally approved by the FDA for newborns in particular, because the studies are often not done in that population. Again, they often start in adults and move gradually down to younger ages when they're doing clinical research studies. But often newborns they're such a fragile population that those studies often don't get done. But the problem is, if you don't actually do a formal research study of a drug in a certain population, then we as doctors don't really know how well it works or how safe it is. And so the consequence of not doing a study is that for every individual doctor and patient pair, they're having to do their own individual study that isn't, to see, is this working for my individual patient? And we don't learn as much to help the broader community or even to help that individual patient as we would if we had already formally done a full study. So, there are a couple of important things, and mostly, again, that's my big theme. New treatment only happens through research. Research, as a benefit, often means you're working with national or international experts in a field, and it's voluntary, but of course that means we need volunteers. When you participate in research, there's a bunch of things that may happen. Some of you have done this. You're going to meet study personnel, you're going to meet experts in the condition, you're going to learn more about your medical condition and contribute to the overall existing knowledge of the disease. You're going to be asked to answer questions about your medical history and about how you feel and what symptoms you're having. Basically, you get to describe your experience to someone whose primary role is to listen and figure out what your experience is. We can have a bunch of different kinds of tests, like we mentioned before, and you might, depending on what kind of study it is, take a medicine for a period of time that's a study medicine, with additional measurements before and after the medicine, and report back about what is your experience being on that medicine. I feel better, I feel worse, my leg itches, I don't know. Lots of things can happen. There are also some very good sources of general information about clinical research participation that you can find on the internet, although I caution people for generally searching the internet for random things because sometimes you can be misled, but the information at the National Institutes of Health website is actually pretty good, and there's a whole website about what are clinical trials and studies at the NIH, and gives a lot of good information. And I'm going to stop there. What kind of questions does anybody have, or thoughts about experience with research?
Point out of these placebo-controlled trials.
As Dr. Bull is saying, with these placebo-controlled trials, they're typically double-blinded, so neither the patient nor the researcher knows who's getting the drug or the placebo. And so there's a separate group, typically called a data monitoring committee or a data safety and monitoring board. And I've been on those, and it's 3 to 5 people who actually know who's getting what. And some of the trials are very big and some are smaller. And what's really interesting is that this placebo stuff, it has both benefits and harm, okay? So when the physician who doesn't know who's getting placebo and who's getting active drug, they will say that it is probable that this drug caused this side effect when they're asked. Because we asked them that, and the patient was on placebo. And one of the things we look at is so for example, nausea and vomiting occur probably about 5% of placebo patients. And we look to see if there was more nausea and vomiting in the treatment group than in the placebo group, because the answer is never 0 for any of these groups. Similarly, when you're asking people about pain, placebo has about a 40% reduction in pain across the board. And so if you don't do a placebo-controlled trial for pain, you're going to get an answer to that whatever you gave them is going to work for pain, because typically if you give them a placebo, you're going to get a 40% effect. And so what we do is we look at the data safety and monitoring board. Our job on that is if something's going in the wrong direction, we're the guys who say, gals, say the trial stops. If the side effects from the drug turn out to be bad, potentially unanticipated, serious side effects, the Data Safety and Monitoring Board basically says, okay, the trial stops today. And that has happened, unfortunately, including in phase 3 trials. So there's a lot of checks and balances in this stuff.
I just want to expand on that a little bit about there's no failed research trial. Because even though we stopped that trial because it didn't have its intended end, there's still a ton of knowledge that was extracted from that. So even if a trial, if you participate in a trial and it doesn't come up with a drug or a treatment for whatever disease state we're studying, that may be another treatment for another disease, or gives us the next clue on where to go. So even though sometimes we're disappointed that something doesn't work, it's still a vast number of knowledge that we can gain from every trial we participate.
And it's actually important for your doctor to know if somebody tried this, and they did a good study, and it didn't work, so we probably shouldn't do it to you. And if you don't have those studies, then you don't really find that out ahead of time. And actually, Marion is right. I mean, I'm involved in a clinical research trial right now of a drug that its original purpose was something entirely, they tried to do it for something entirely different and it didn't work for that, but it makes perfect sense for this disease, this other disease.